All right, we're about to break down a theory from our source material that suggests there's a huge, kind of hidden shift happening in the global financial system. It's all about a historical pattern, a cycle that keeps repeating, and what the authors are calling the Great Decoupling. So let's dive in and see what this is all about. So, our story really kicks off with this one almost unbelievable number: $1.4 trillion. According to the documents we're looking at, this is how much capital major Wall Street firms quietly moved into China. But here's where it gets really strange: the timing. This massive capital shift was supposedly happening at the exact same time the headlines were screaming about a trade war. So the sources are pointing out this huge disconnect. You've got a public fight on one hand and a massive private financial partnership happening on the other. And that brings us to what the source material calls the 1.4 trillion betrayal. The whole theory here is that this number isn't just some random data point. It's the key that unlocks a much bigger story about debt, currency, and a pretty incredible transfer of wealth. The authors draw a straight line from that capital moving out to, well, to this chart. What you're seeing is the U.S. national debt, which has just skyrocketed past $36 trillion. The theory claims that as this public debt in the West just keeps piling up, financial elites are strategically getting their own money out of the way. You know, this quote from the source material really just cuts right to the chase. It paints this picture of a total separation between the political show we all see and the cold, hard math of global finance. The main idea here is that while we were all focused on the drama over tariffs, the actual gears of investment portfolios were shifting in a massive way, completely behind the scenes. Okay, so how does this all fit together? Well, the documents argue that none of this is random, not at all. They claim it's a predictable historical cycle, a pattern of collapse that has played out with every single dominant global power. At the very core of this whole theory is something they call the four-stage mechanism. It works like this. Stage 1, you create a monopoly on printing money. That lets you move to Stage 2. You use that power to expand the government through massive debt. But that inevitably leads to Stage 3. The system gets overextended, you start to see cracks, and the currency itself gets devalued. And then comes the really critical part, Stage 4. The people who built the system, they move their capital out before anyone else realizes what's happening. And this is the historical parallel the theory is built on. They're comparing today's capital moving to China with what British elites did in the late 1800s, funding American railroads right before the British pound began its long decline. The argument is simple. This movement of elite money is a recurring signal. It's a warning sign of a major power shift on the horizon. To really drive home that currency debasement stage, the documents make another historical comparison, and this one's a gut punch: Weimar Germany. They put the hyperinflation that completely destroyed the German middle class right next to the slow, steady erosion of the dollar's value since it was cut loose from gold back in 1971. Which brings us to the final and maybe the most critical stage of this whole mechanism: elites exit, public pays. The theory really zeroes in on how wealth is supposedly protected for a select few, while everybody else is left holding the bag in a failing system. I mean, this quote just says it all, doesn't it? It bluntly summarizes the entire argument. The pattern isn't framed as some kind of accident, but as a calculated transfer of wealth. According to the source, the system is basically designed to let those who understand its inner workings protect themselves, while the general public is left with currency that's losing its value. So, you might be asking, how is any of this even possible? The source calls the enabling factor a fiat monopoly. What that basically means is when one currency, like the US dollar, is the main currency used for everything globally: trade, banking, all of it. There's no real check on how much of it can be printed. And according to this theory, that's the system's fatal flaw. But okay, the story doesn't just end in collapse. The documents actually pivot here to what they describe as a solution that's being built right now, in real time, an alternative system designed to work completely outside of that fiat monopoly. And they call this alternative the gold corridor. The theory describes it as a decentralized network of physical gold vaults, mostly in the East, that's designed to re-anchor money to a real, tangible asset that can't just be printed. The goal is to create a new foundation of trust for international finance. Now, this might look like a boring table, but the source says a rule change buried in here is an absolute game changer. For decades, banks had to treat gold as a risky Tier 3 asset, counting it at only half its value. But new banking regulations have completely flipped that. gold is now reclassified as a top tier, tier 1 asset valued at 100%, which basically makes it just as good as cash on a bank's balance sheet. So this development is framed as the end of a 50-year chapter. That temporary measure back in 1971, the one that created the fiat monopoly in the first place, well, according to this theory, this reclassification of gold signals that the era is finally over. Okay, so if the old system is failing, where do you go? This final section of the source material really hones in on what it presents as the two main escape routes from paper currency. And what's interesting is the authors don't just point to gold. They actually lay out two parallel solutions. You have gold, whose value is built on thousands of years of history, that's trust through time. And then you have Bitcoin, whose value is built on cryptography and a decentralized network. That's trust through math. The common denominator here is that they're both hard assets. What does that mean? It means they can't just be created out of thin air by a central bank. They exist outside the control of the traditional system. And, maybe most importantly, they give people a choice. According to the source, that's their real power. And so, the analysis kind of ends by turning the question back on you. If this historical pattern really is playing out again, the author suggests the only thing left to decide is, what are you going to do about it? And that brings us to the source material's final, incredibly provocative message. It's a stark summary of the entire theory. In a system that's seemingly designed to devalue currency, the biggest risk is just holding onto it. A powerful thought to end on, for sure.